Hello, my name's Mike. I'm a minister in Coventry, and I'm going to bring a message today from Acts chapter 27. First of all, I begin with a story from Japan, actually. A man called Chuck Sly, who lived in Japan, or rather on an island off Japan, and he gives a story, happened some time ago, when he was in a boat with friends, and he says that he encountered a really scary storm. And he tells the story, he says, with each wave, the boat was like a plastic toy bobbling in the ocean. We were engulfed by waves, sometimes 5 times higher than the boat. And this is what he says: I got right with God real quick because I knew my number was up. So that's a true story of a chap who survived a terrible storm. And the title of this message is How Can We Survive a Terrifying Storm? The inspiration for this message actually began with a comment on an email from the Baptist Union, and I'll share more about that later. In the meantime, Sharon is going to read the passage in Acts chapter 27.
The reading today is Acts 27. Paul sails for Rome. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. The next day we landed at Sidon, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, allowed him to go to his friends so they may provide for his needs. From there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus, because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. We made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens. Much time had been lost and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them,
Men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also.
But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. Since the harbour was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbour in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure, so the men hoisted it aboard. Then they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Because they were afraid they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that next day, they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said,
Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic, when about midnight the sailors sensed they were approaching land. They took soundings and found that the water was 40 metres deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 30 metres deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers,
Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved.
So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat.
For the last 14 days,
He said,
you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now, I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head.
After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. When they had eaten as much as they wanted, they lightened the ship by throwing the grain into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach, where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea and at the same time untied the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move, and the stern was broken into pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to kill the prisoners to prevent any of them from swimming away and escaping. But the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely.
Thank you, Sharon. So I'm going to make 3 points arising from that passage. 3 directions that we need to look when we are in a storm. And 3 directions which the Apostle Paul, 3 directions which he directed his gaze in that crisis. First of all, we need to look upwards. Paul looked upwards. We need to seek God's guidance. Reading verses 23 and 24, last night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood beside me and said, Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given us the lives of all who sail with you. Well, that's interesting, the way that Paul received God's guidance. I'm sure in the midst of that storm, he was constantly praying, looking to God for help, and God received very concrete guidance, very clear guidance, guaranteeing his safety and the safety of all of those on board that ship. Well, of course, we can't expect God to 100% guarantee our physical safety. But nevertheless, it's a good principle that we should look for God's help as we navigate any storm that we go through of our own. Of course, currently we're trying to navigate this storm of the virus, of the coronavirus. We need to look to God for his guidance. We need to look upwards. We need to wait for God's deliverance. Verse 25, so keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Paul trusted God. He totally trusted God. And he was quite audacious, he was quite bold to tell the people on the boat that God was going to save them all. 276 passengers. The author of Acts, who was a doctor called Luke gives us all the historical details. Paul said in advance that all 276 passengers on board would be saved. Well, Paul believed that God was in control. Do you believe that God is in control of your life at this time? So much uncertainty in terms of both the present and the future. Do you have that assurance that God is in control? Do you have that peace of mind that God is in control of your life, that God is in control of his world? Well, God is in control. We need to trust him. We need to wait and to pray for his deliverance, just as Paul did. A chap called Rick Crandall, he tells a story going back a long, long time to when he was much younger, back in 1982. And he was actually on a plane, and he tells a story about being on this plane and hitting some very bad weather. It was a big 747, and he says that the wings of this plane were flapping like a bird. It was so rough that one of the flight attendants couldn't make it back to her seat, and she sat on the floor in the aisle about 15 foot in front of Rick. And he says that she was terrified. And then he goes on to say this: my rule of thumb is this: if the flight attendant is happy, generally you are fine. But once the flight attendant is scared, you know you've got a problem. Well, he says, the plane got so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Nobody was talking. I guarantee you, most of us were praying, waiting for God's deliverance. It's amazing, even people who don't normally pray, or don't normally pray very much, when there's a crisis, suddenly so many people cry out to God for help. Well, that's what Paul did in this storm on that ship 2,000 years ago. Looked upwards, looked for God's guidance, waited for God's deliverance. That was the first direction that Paul looked. The second direction was downwards. He looked downwards. We need to look downwards as well. What do I mean by that? What do I mean in terms of Paul? Well, first of all, we read in verse 18 that there was a decision made to discard the cargo. We read in that verse, we took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. It's not the first time in the Bible that we read about a storm and a ship and cargo being thrown overboard. I don't know whether you're familiar with the Old Testament, with the book of Jonah, where Jonah's shipmates threw cargo overboard in a storm to increase their chances of survival, and then they woke Jonah up. And of course, Jonah himself was the cause of the problem in that instance. And I think that maybe you know the story. But I tell you, there is a spiritual principle arising from this business of discarding cargo in a storm. I don't know whether you are a Christian as you listen to this message. I don't know whether you want to become a stronger Christian. Let me tell you that sometimes we have to be prepared to throw cargo overboard, as it were. Precious cargo even, to get rid of it in order to be able to concentrate on our commitment to God and our connection with him. So Paul looked downwards, and the decision was made on that ship that they had to start chucking things into the sea. The cargo was discarded. And then the second point here is the instruction from Paul in verse 31 that everyone stays on board, because some of the soldiers were looking to escape the ship. And Paul said to the centurion, unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved. So again, there is a principle here. If we use the idea of the ship as a metaphor, sometimes when we're in a storm, we need to stay in the ship. Well, what is our ship? Well, most of you listening to this message I would suspect some members of Meredith Road Baptist Church, where I'm the minister, and maybe you would consider that our ship at this time is being part of this church. Even though we can't meet in the building, we're meeting online, and maybe that is our ship, this collective commitment we have to one another as well as to God. Maybe the church itself is our ship. But let me tell you, unlike that ship in the story in Acts chapter 27, this ship will not be broken to pieces, because God has got plans for his church and for his people here in this part of Coventry. And can I encourage you to remain part of this fellowship, even though we're disconnected and we're having to meet via Zoom all the time? And maybe part of the reason that you used to come to church so regularly is because you had a particular function, a particular role, a particular job within the church, and for the moment you no longer have that responsibility, and so perhaps you don't see the need to stay loyal. Well, I would ask you to reconsider, if you've not really been with us very much recently when we've done the Zooms on Sundays and on Thursdays. We need you. We need everyone to stay on the ship. So stay loyal. We need your input. We need your involvement. And then the third point, look inwards. Eat some food. Verse 35, 36. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Look inwards. We need to look inwardly for the Holy Spirit to strengthen us to cope with the massive uncertainty in the weeks and months ahead. Look inwards. We need to look after ourselves in this crisis, in this storm. We must try and eat properly, sleep properly. Mentally, it's important to think clearly. For me recently, after the easing of the lockdown restrictions, I was able to walk for 21 miles and got really good perspective, able to think more clearly. It's important that we all do that. So we look after our physical needs, our mental needs, emotionally, how important it is for us to keep our feelings under control. And most importantly of all, to look after our spiritual needs. We're talking about eating some food. Well, what about spiritual food? What about the bread of life? What about God's word? What about the Bible? What about being in communication with God? We need to look inwards. And Paul encouraged the 276 people on that boat to look inwards, to strengthen themselves for the turmoil ahead by eating some food. And then secondly, the centurion is very involved in what goes on. The second point is to get to land. Get to land. The centurion ordered those who could swim to jump overboard and get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. Well, let me tell you another story. Many years ago, there were 21 young Americans who decided to hold a party. They were told that a hurricane was probably on the way, but nevertheless they decided to have a hurricane party. And even when the police told them that they had to relocate, they refused. And sadly and tragically, all but one of that party of 21 people were killed when the storm came. We need to take the storms of life seriously. This coronavirus storm that maybe you're struggling with, we need to get to a stable place, get to land, get to a secure place, a solid place, a stable place. A place where we can cope with both the external storms and also the inner storms. Some of you are coping quite well perhaps with what's going on nationally, but you're struggling with what's going on inside. We need to look inwards and look to God for his help, just as Paul encouraged all of those people on the boat to eat some food, and then ultimately they were able to get to land and they all survived. We can survive this too. We need to look inwards. We need to look to God for his help and his strengthening. So we need to look inwards. as well as downwards and as well as upwards, which is what Paul did. He looked upwards to God. He looked inwards to find courage. And he looked downwards at the ship and in terms of the cargo. And I've already mentioned that we must be ready to sacrifice any precious cargo that takes our focus off God. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning of this message that it was inspired by comments from someone at the Baptist Union. And I'm going to end by reading that email that I received from Richard Wilson at the Baptist Union. And this is what he said. Perhaps the only certainty is we need to be flexible and adaptable to new circumstances. In our churches, we will need to have wisdom about what to cling to and what to let go of. I say amen. Like Paul and his shipmates in the storm in Acts 27, we'll probably have to throw overboard some things that seem precious a short time ago. And he concludes like this: may God bless you with wisdom in making such choices. Amen to that. May God bless us all and give us the wisdom that we need to know what changes need to be made in our personal lives and in our corporate lives together, in church. May God guide us and show us the direction that we need to go. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you.